I don't know if you heard, but marijuana was legalized in the last election in 2 more states and in the District of Columbia. As of the last election, medical marijuana is also legal in 23 states. And if you go to these stores, these new retail stores that sell this new commodity called marijuana, you run across some of the brand names that you see up here in this poster, right? There are hundreds of these names, by the way, but they Californian skunk, or maybe you'd like some nice White Widow, or my favorite, Light of Jah. Now clearly the marketing teams in charge of our marijuana commodity sort of participate in what you might call sort of like late hippie irony. But now that marijuana has become a product, there are other people that are engaging in this kind of new dialogue about what do we call marijuana? How do we sell it? How do we market it? We're watching really an underground illegal market surface to become a visible legal market. This is a guy I hung out with for a while in Seattle. He's a former Microsoft executive, Jamin Shively, who stepped down and started this company called Diego Pellicer. It's named for his great-grandfather, who was a Mexican hemp farmer, right? And Jamin is trying to corner the market on what we might call sort of like high-end pot, sort of the Bordeaux of marijuana. These are the names of his brands: Diego Reserva, Selección Armada, Juan de Fuca, might have to work on that one, Libertad, right? These are meant to invoke some sort of like caballero aristocracy, right? And speak to us on that level. And what we're really watching, like I said, is this kind of, the language of marijuana, the old hippie language, is kind of being traded out for a new kind of retail language. And already I found this. This is a map of how to match your pot with your wine. There may come a time when you're going out to dinner with a client at some point and you will say, ah, yes, White Widow. I hear that pairs well with a nice Grenache. How did we get here? If you look at this map, or this chart, you'll see that legalizing pot, only 10 years ago, 73% of Americans were against it. That was only 10 years ago. And now, a majority of Americans are in favor of legalized pot. A lot of people change their minds in a short period of time. We've seen this before. Here. 15 years ago, 62% of Americans completely opposed the idea of gay marriage. And then something happened. Minds got changed, and now it's a bare majority. But we see now that these two issues, which are rolling through the states and being legalized all across America, and these are two of the most sort of really fundamentally upending social issues of our time, right? These are, when the people opposed to gay marriage said, like, this is a complete redefinition of marriage, this is changing everything we know about marriage, they weren't wrong. They were right. This is a complete rewriting of what marriage is. And yet a majority of Americans, at a time when the national country is so conservative, have changed their minds. Okay, they're high, they're at a party, there's the ex-husband, he's coming over there. Oh, here we go.
Hello, Jane.
Adam, this is Agnes, Jake's wife.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, that little clip, and let me just explain what it was. That was the entire pot scene from a 2009 romantic comedy called It's Complicated, okay? The whole scene is really just Meryl Streep is formerly married to Alec Baldwin. She's going out on a date with Steve Martin. They get high, they run into Alec Baldwin at a party. That's the whole joke, right? And it's as mild as you just saw. So when this movie came out in 2009, it had a very difficult time, in part because it was rated R, right? And it was rated R as it got leaked in the papers, not because of vulgar language or sexuality or violence, but because, can you see that phrase down at the bottom? It featured pot smoking with no bad consequences. That was a violation of the Hollywood rule. You can't have pot smoking with no bad consequences. Someone has to die, someone has to drive off a bridge, someone has to jump out of a building. That has to happen, or you get an R rating. Now, maybe one of the things I like about this clip is we might be seeing sort of the intersection of a very old narrative about pot and a very new one, right? Because, of course, what we saw with Meryl Streep and Steve Martin was a kind of harmless little moment of people getting high. Responsible use, just like you hear often about drinking beer or wine, that there is such a thing as this, right? And understand that there is this distinction that I want to make here between these two narratives, between what we officially say and what we will actually act on, okay? Now understand that right now in America, marijuana is what's known as a Schedule I drug. There are 5 schedules, and they descend in order of danger. Schedule I, the most dangerous drugs that we have. A Schedule I drug is heroin, a Schedule I drug is LSD, and a Schedule I drug is marijuana. What's a Schedule II drug? PCP. Crystal meth is a Schedule II drug. That's the official narrative of the country of the United States of America. And if you ask people, are drugs bad? They would say, yes, drugs are bad. That's what they believe. But what do they actually act on? What do they actually know? And I think what was happening in that Meryl Streep clip is that we saw sort of the Hollywood trying to enforce the old narrative, and the movie trying to sort of deal with some gulf exists. You have to understand how we come to know information. Now, there are many ways we study in class. There's all kinds of ways in which information comes into our heads. And one of the stories that you'll see every couple of months is this one, that we have developed these Google minds, that we have offshored all this information to our iPhones, that we don't have memory anymore. We don't have these personal interactions. What we have is Google and the iPhone. All arguments get settled, right? But here's the reality. We've always had a Google mind. As cognitive scientists will tell you, most of us sort of offshore a great deal of what we believe in the minds of our friends and our acquaintances, our relatives, right? I don't really keep a lot of knowledge in my memory bank about sports because my friend Kevin, he's a whiz-bang at that stuff. I can just ask Kevin. Or I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, where genealogy and chronology and history is very, very important. But I've never stuffed my head with any of that stuff because my mother is just unbelievable. 3rd cousins, twice removed. She knows who all those people are. I don't have to bother myself with that information. I can move on. So we've all offshored information with our friends. We've been doing this Google thing since time began, right? Most of us brush our teeth with fluoride toothpaste. And if I asked you, should we have fluoride in the water? I would wager that almost everyone in this room would say, sure, yeah, that's good, that's good. But you know, there are people who think that that's bad. It's a small minority, but there are people who think that fluoride is what the Nazis used to kill people. They think it's a government plot to destroy our brains. They think fluoride is really, really bad. But overwhelmingly, most people who believe that fluoride is good match what they believe with their actions. In other words, this is one of these things where there is no gulf. Almost everybody believes that fluoride is good, and almost everybody acts on that information. But here's the question I want to ask you. You brush your teeth with fluoride. You don't mind having fluoride in the water. How do you know that that's true? How do you know? Did you go read a fluoride study? I don't think so. You used your Google friends. You are of the tribe of people that think fluoride is okay. That's how you know. And that's how we know a lot of things. This is a chart that shows people who believe that the top line, the light greenish one, that ends in 42%, shows that almost half of this country believes that we were invented in this form by God instantaneously. This story comes out every couple of years and scientists go completely ape, you know? It's like, oh my God, half the country believes in intelligent design and creation science. This is crazy. We've got to beef up our STEM programs. We've got to encourage young people to study science. And it's true. 42% of Americans will tell you that God invented man and woman in the current form instantaneously at some point in the past. So you would think logic would follow, that if that's what they believe, then that's what they would act on. And so you would think that maybe something close to 42% of our school districts would teach this. But they don't. In fact, almost no one teaches it. And every time someone does try to teach it, it's a huge stink, and there's a huge fight, and invariably, intelligent design goes down, as it did here in Pennsylvania, very famously, just a few years ago. There was one prior to that in Kansas. And often what happens is parents, who if you ask them at the door in a poll, do you believe that God created man and woman in the current form that we exist, at some point in the past, they would say yes. But those same people go and argue for evolution to be taught in the schools and beat these battles, right? And when these things happen, often the victory is brutal. You get headlines like this. And then right after these battles go down, there's often some part of the media circus is that one of our sort of like appointed media clowns steps up and says something. In this case, it was Pat Robertson, who came out and said that God will probably strike some terrible natural disaster on Pennsylvania. And when that happens, understand, it will be because they rejected intelligent design. There's a small group of people that thought that made sense. But for most people, they laughed at that. Because people like Donald Trump and Pat Robertson, these people occupy the role of sort of giant Macy's Day Parade balloon-like clowns whose occasional utterances are almost entirely designed to make one tribe or another cling to their views. Now, the right wing has their clowns and the left wing has their clowns. And for the right wing, one of their clowns is, say, like Michael Moore, right? Or this guy. This is Al Gore with Bon Jovi. This is at the opening of An Inconvenient Truth. Now, one of the interesting things about Al Gore making that movie and winning the Nobel Prize the following year is that the peak of belief in global climate change occurred right around then and started to decline. It was 71% in 2008, and it's dropped to 59% in 2010. And since then, the people who believe in man-made climate change has dropped to 49%. And information scientists are constantly asking themselves, why did that happen? What happened? Well, you can point to a couple of things that happened in 2008. Obama got elected, maybe that drove some people, but that seems hardly to pertain to climate change. And there was a kind of climate change science scandal. But one thing that happened was Al Gore got a Nobel Prize for An Inconvenient Truth. And one set of information scientists note that very few people saw this movie. And the people who did see it already believed it anyway. But you know what did happen when he got that Nobel Prize? People saw the people who saw that movie. And when people saw the people who saw that movie, many of them may well have thought, you know what? Not my tribe. I don't believe that anymore, because they believe that. And maybe that's why the numbers went down. And yet, in Florida, just a couple of years ago, a local community decided to take action on climate change and put up, walls in the sea and do whatever they had to do to protect their town from climate change, right? And if you look in this article, you'll see it says right there, Jacobs called it notable for bringing Republicans, Democrats, Tea Party members, and independents together to agree on common regional goals. In other words, when people asked to act on the reality of climate change, they did that. They might say they believed that global climate change wasn't happening, but when it came down to taking action, they did. There's that gulf between what you say you believe for some people and what you will actually act on, right? So a lot of this comes from the work of Dan Kahan at Yale. Here is a stoner. We know this guy because this is the cliche of what a stoner is. And many ideas come out of this picture, right, when you look at him. And we think, oh, that's a stoner. He's a loser. He's never going to get ahead. He's kind of incoherent, inarticulate. And he's a loser because he smokes pot. That's the official narrative. That's the one we all grew up on. That's the reefer madness narrative. But then what happened was medical marijuana drove a whole new cohort of pot smokers to suddenly be visible to the rest of us. And so then we had to ask ourselves, is she a loser? How about this girl? How about this guy? Is he a loser? And suddenly that question started to fall apart and the cliche started to crumble. And all of a sudden the pot smoker was many people, and often just some guy trying to get some weed to take home to his wife. As more and more of these pot smokers came out, who were not the cliche, and all of that crumbled away, One of the things that happened is that people who didn't smoke pot suddenly knew people who did and realized that the cliche was a lie, and also that the sky didn't fall. And so when the issue of pot legalization comes up in the polls and in the ballots, suddenly there's a new cohort that is willing to vote for it. We see this happen over and over again. You know, when I was a little boy, this is what a gay man looked like. This is from a movie called The Boys in the Band. It was very big when I was in the middle school. It's ancient, and it's basically a gay positive movie, but it existed long ago, and so it had to traffic in, or had to deal with the cliches that existed then. And in the 70s, in the media image, if you were a gay man, you were thin, you had fairly atrocious hair, and you had an inordinate fondness for neckerchiefs. Bad hair, neckerchief, gay. But then what happened, as more and more gay people, men and women of all ages, of all kinds, began to come out of the closet, more and more non-gay people came to know them and realized that it wasn't the guy in the kerchief, that it was something else, it was something bigger, it was more complicated. And that cliche began to fall apart. And we suddenly realized, oh, maybe gay men can have nice hair. But what really happened too was that the sky didn't fall. And so when the issue came up on the ballot, should the majority of Americans give these people the right to marry, the right to have the exact same rights that the rest of us have? Non-gay people were suddenly comfortable to vote, yeah. And it's because of those modest and small conversations. Revolutions don't really happen on cable TV or in the media or on election day or in that paralyzed swamp that is Washington, D.C. They end there. Changing a mind is really the most local of local politics. It begins by breaking down a cliche when a kind of uncloseted cohort begins to emerge and show us the reality of a lived life. So, wild and unlikely revolutions are still very possible in America. It's just that if the science is to be believed, more likely than not, they'll begin with the conversations we all have when this talk is over. Thank you.